Welcome, everybody. I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional custodians of the land on which the Melbourne Law School stands. So we start by paying respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognising the care for country of our traditional custodians that extends to sea country. And that's fitting for today's seminar on blue bonds, protection of the seas and oceans through financialization. It's my great pleasure. I'm Margaret Young, Director of the Institute for International Law and the Humanities and Professor here at the Melbourne Law School, to welcome our ILA visitor, Arınç Kılıç, who harks originally from Turkey, but is currently a teaching assistant and PhD candidate at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. As part of that work, there's a very heavy socio-legal element, which has taken Arınç to Seychelles, Belize and other significant oceans places to conduct research on blue bonds. So we're very fortunate to catch him at this moment in the PhD where he can present some of his preliminary findings, particularly about these very complex legal instruments that are helping to finance conservation and sustainability initiatives in the oceans and are proving compelling for other countries where I think international law, law of the sea, human rights law and environmental law have a lot to offer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for this. And hello, everyone. Thank you for coming here. So I will present some preliminary findings from my PhD project. Please feel free to stop me if something is unclear, because I will be speaking about a little bit complex financial structures as well. So just feel free to stop me for, ask a question for clarification. And I'm planning to submit my PhD in November, so I'm open to very good feedback for improvement. So you can be my worst critic here for anything. Okay, so what is a blue bond? Blue bonds are financial instruments through which public and private actors raise funding for sustainable marine-related activities. So the first blue bond was issued in 2018 by the Seychelles, which is a small island developing state, for sustainable fisheries. And in this structure, in this very basic structure of a blue bond, basically you have impact investors who don't want only profit from their investments, but also want to create social and environmental positive impact, right? And they would invest their money in a blue bond, and a blue bond issuer will promise them that they will spend the money on sustainable marine-related activities. And of course, these sustainable marine-related activities, these type of projects are defined by the issuer. So however the issuer defines that would be those activities. And of course, through that, investors also create a positive environmental and social impact. That's the kind of the main basic structure with assumption. Just to give a basic general regulatory landscape of the blue bond sector, there is no international regulation of blue bonds. In some jurisdictions, some financial supervisors try to establish guidelines for green debt securities in the financial market. They have some guidelines, they have some eligible activities that actually the issuers are confined with, but in general, they are not regulated. These jurisdictions are very rare. So in this context, there is a market actor who has a soft law instrument that is green bond principles. So green bonds have been already in market since 2008. And generally both green bonds and blue bonds are structured based on this model. So there are 4 green bond principles issued by the International Capital Markets Association. And basically these 4 principles say that you, as an issuer, you need to have a framework in place in which you define your eligible activities, how you define sustainability, and how you measure and communicate impact. So in this framework, you need to clarify how you select projects. You need to have a specific account. You need to deposit the money from blue bonds and green bonds in a specific account so that investors can establish a causality between their funds and the finance projects. And in the end, it requires you to communicate an impact report, right, to the investors, but also to the wider public. But again, these 4 principles, this framework that is issued by the International Capital Markets Association can be considered as a soft law, basically. It's not binding at all. So it's a market principle, market instrument, but according to their research, around 98% of green and blue bonds in the market comply with these principles. So it has a very strong compliance pull, if you can speak of something like that. Okay, and so in 2020, when I was shaping this project, when I was writing this PhD project, I noticed that in the literature, there was so much praise of blue bonds, and everyone was kind of indexing the measure of success to the amount of funding that is raised through these blue bonds, right? And also, on the other hand, gray literature was focusing on whether these instruments actually provide environmental efficiency and environmental impact, really. But then they were mostly focusing on greenwashing, which is really about the fact that if issuers spend money on type of projects that they promise, right? And if they also acquire an unfair advantage through these environmental promises in the market. So a little bit this troubled me, because I was thinking that, okay, I'm an international lawyer, but then how can we ensure that these instruments, blue bonds, can actually be situated in international environmental law, right? Actually, to what extent we can claim that they support the objectives of the Paris Agreement and the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this was a little bit my starting point for shaping the project. And then, of course, then I came to examine these instruments with the lens of international environmental law and a human rights-based approach also, right? And to do so, I needed to, first of all, map my legal framework. And there is not much conceptualization, or at least kind of, unified conceptualization of the rules and norms to which climate and biodiversity finance flows need to adhere in the literature, at least in English-speaking literature. I couldn't find, so I needed to, first of all, map the norms and normative logic of climate finance and biodiversity finance as established in international environmental law and human rights law. So basically, I conceptualized these norms and rules as the international law of sustainable finance, that are the set of rules and principles that basically blue bonds need to adhere to if they claim to be sustainable, if they claim to be climate or biodiversity finance. And there are 5 pillars. In my research, I identified 5 pillars that that are both common in the Paris Agreement and also in under Convention on Biological Diversity, right? So I mapped the Conference of Party documents, the financing committees, etc., their decisions, and IPCC documents, kind of how they define the outcomes of finance and how they define the standards that they need to comply with. So these 5 pillars, of course, the first one is common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, right? So here, basically, I will go very shortly here. So the first principle is basically about the fact that developing countries, and especially small island developing states, are entitled to financial assistance to implement the objectives of the Paris Agreement, but also a Convention on Biological Diversity. Of course, after the Paris Agreement, this principle has been interpreted a little slightly differently, in the way that now each party need to put their highest possible ambition on the table, right? So so for instance, in Convention on Biological Diversity, in the original text, actually implementation by small island developing states was dependent on financial assistance and technology transfer by developed countries, but it's not the case anymore if you look at the Conference of Party documents. So, but still, developing countries and island states are entitled to receive financial assistance to implement their objectives. New and additional finance, the second pillar, is important, especially in terms of environmental effectiveness, right? So basically here, additionality is defined by the IPCC as the progress and environmental improvement beyond business as usual scenario. So you need to have a baseline scenario, the current state of affairs, and then you need to show what your improvement is in terms of climate mitigation, climate resilience. And also, when it comes to Convention on Biological Diversity, this is more expressed as tangible outcomes in terms of meeting the objectives of the convention, right? So it's sustainable use, conservation, or restoration. These 3 tangible outcomes in terms of these 3 projects. The third one is, of course, about the availability of funds availability of sufficient funds to meet the objectives of Rio Conventions of International Environmental Law on a precautionary and timely manner, right? This didn't come up so much in my case study, so I will continue. Subsidiarity, that's one of the most important things, and that's the most problematic one that came up in my case studies when it comes to small island developing states, right? Because capacity building is also very much a topic among small island developing states, and subsidiarity and local ownership. Basically, this pillar ensures that climate and biodiversity finance flows actually are shaped according to local circumstances and, more importantly, local needs and local vulnerabilities, so that they actually create positive impact for people on the ground. And the fifth pillar, human rights-based approach. This is, of course, importance of human rights is very much emphasized both under the Paris Agreement and Convention on Biological Diversity. But of course, especially with the emergence of the right to a healthy environment, you see more kind of the convergence of these regimes, and any climate finance or biodiversity finance flow need to comply with international human rights law. Basically, this is kind of that pillar, that requirement, and that came up in my case studies a lot as well. Okay, so I have 3 case studies. The first one was Seychelles sovereign blue bond that was for sustainable fisheries. Second one is Nordic Investment Bank, Nordic-Baltic blue bonds. Those blue bonds were the second blue bonds that were issued for the protection of the Baltic Sea. And third one is Belize, for ocean conservation swap that was financed by blue bonds in Caribbean. I wanted to have case studies both from the global south and the global north to also see the differences. What are the common aspects and what are the different aspects in the legal structures of blue bonds, and how things work differently. I have a mixed method approach. So to map international law of sustainable finance, I have the doctrinal legal methodology, of course, and to see if my cases, if what's happening on the ground complies with those principles. I have the doctrinal legal methodology, but also to understand what's happening on the ground, I fill that data gap with semi-structured interviews. So I had a fieldwork in Seychelles, I had a fieldwork in Belize, and I interviewed some people in Sweden and Finland for the Nordic-Baltic blue bonds. And to make sense of the divergences from international environmental law and international human rights law in different modalities of blue bonds, I rely on critical legal theory. If I have time, I will come to that in the end, or we can engage in questions more. Okay, so the first case study is the Seychelles blue bond. Again, the blue bond was issued for sustainable fisheries here. It was advertised as so. This was the world's first blue bond that was very much subsidized by the World Bank as well. So the amount was $15 million, comparatively small structure, small amount. And the interest rate normally was 6.5%, which is quite high for an island state, but that of course reflects the credit rating of the Seychelles. But then World Bank subsidized it by providing a guarantee and a concessional loan to the Seychelles for interest payments, so that Seychelles is effectively paying 2.8% interest over 10 years. But still, it's important to note that investors are receiving 6.5% over 10 years. That's very important. So you can see how profitable this type of structure is, because of especially that 2/3 of it is guaranteed by the World Bank. Okay, so the proceeds from this blue bond are used differently. So 3 million, the 20% of the bond was used as grants in the Seychelles for marine conservation activities. But the 80% of it, most of it, the $12 million was deposited into an account of the Development Bank of Seychelles to be given to the fisheries sector in the form of blue loans. So these loans have 4% interest rate, and they are used for local fisheries value chain. But what do we mean by that? Of course, right? That's the question, kind of. How do we define sustainable fisheries in this context? So in this case, I identified 3 legal issues after my fieldwork. I will speak about environmental additionality and subsidiarity local ownership. We can engage with the CBDRRC later. But basically, sustainable fisheries is a problematic label in this blue bond. So then there are 3 blue loans allocated from the proceeds. So these are in total $9 million of the 12 million reserved for, that was earmarked for blue loans. So the first one was given to a company that will use the money for expanding fish processing plant. And of course, this company is basically exporting the processed fish and fish products from Seychelles. The second loan was given to a laboratory, the biosafety laboratory, that will check the fish products for export and confirm that they meet biosafety requirements for international markets. And this will be this is advertised as the first and only biosafety laboratory that meets international standards as well. So it's really key for export. And the third loan went to a prawn aquaculture. Seychelles had an aquaculture facility already until 2008, but for economic reasons, they had closed down. And the government restarted it after they developed an aquaculture development policy. But the aquaculture basically is producing high-value prawns for export again. So what we see here is that actually all the money is spent on fish processing plants and the required infrastructure for it for export, right? So the fish and fish products from here would not be used for internal market. And the government openly communicates that in their aquaculture policy, in their documents. But this is not surprising because the blue bond was already, it was in its initial design. If you look into details, it was already designed as a kind of development financing, not sustainable finance, right? It's development financing because the government tries to have higher GDP by increasing their export, basically. But what is the relation of these investments to sustainability or sustainable fisheries, sustainable fish stocks? Nothing so far, according to my findings. So that's why there's a legal tension with environmental additionality requirement, right? So if you try to think of this as a biodiversity finance that will contribute to the objectives of sustainable use, conservation, or restoration of fish stocks in the Seychelles, there is no causality basically with any of these objectives. So the government kind of thought that, okay, back in 2018, they were establishing 30% of their EEZ as marine protected areas, and they expected that the GDP, the contribution of the fisheries sector to GDP might decrease. Why? Because small-scale fisheries will be displaced from some marine protected areas, and then their revenue might decrease. So they wanted to somehow compensate it, but they really didn't. They are not really compensating the local fisheries, but they are compensating the GDP percentage to kind of recover from it. And this information came from one of the old ministers in the Seychelles. They openly kind of said that this was what we wanted to do. So of course, by doing so, the main purpose of this blue bond was, rather than sustainability, to acquire development gains, right? And that is why there's a tension with environmental additionality requirement, I believe. The second aspect, this lack of sustainability in this, well, lack of sustainability, I shouldn't say that, because anyways, these investments go through environmental and social impact assessment, of course, they meet the requirements and then they take place, but they don't create the biodiversity outcomes, tangible biodiversity outcomes. And of course, it brings us to the second legal tension, subsidiarity and local ownership. The problem is that Seychelles has actually exceeded its 30% marine protected areas. Now they protected more than 30% of their EEZ as marine protected areas, which means that there is less and less revenue for the local fisheries. And local fisheries is quite central to local food security in the Seychelles because they provide the main protein intake of the country, right? So they are quite key. The government, if you read the government documents, it's kind of very widely accepted, but they also indicate that they are having less and less revenue. Many fisher folk actually are leaving the job. So then, of course, a little bit, this brings the question, okay, but this money could be used actually to compensate local fisheries, right? And kind of to strengthen local food security. And and this is not because this would not be materialized or local fisheries, small-scale fisher folk, they lack ideas. There is no such thing. I interviewed 7 different fisheries associations in the Seychelles, and basically they have many different ideas about small-scale fish processing, creating high-value products, and even for export. They have so many ideas. They see the reality. They are the ones that live with it. But of course, they cannot find support because basically they don't have capacity to go through such a loan application. Many of them don't even have bank accounts in the Seychelles. So then you expect them, then you're expecting to kind of support them these type of blue loans who cannot even go through an application process. And of course, here is a quote from a public officer from the Department of Blue Economy in the Seychelles. They basically actually accept that kind of, it's really not designed for local communities, but for bigger businesses. And also another thing about local ownership is that in the beginning, blue loans will be only given to Seychelles businesses, but now there was no uptake, so they changed the requirements. So now businesses that are majority owned by foreigners can also apply these blue loans. So imagine then how, when you are trying to kind of have development gains and increase GDP, in these companies, all the profit will end up abroad. So, and of course, kind of also from a human rights-based perspective, supporting small-scale fisher folk, small-scale fisheries, and also their associations for fish processing would comply with voluntary SSF guidelines, of course, as governments have the duty to support their organizational structures and investments in the post-harvest subsector to contribute to improve, to help them improve their livelihoods. Okay, and here is a quote from an artisanal fisherman. This is from a very recent social impact assessment that was done by the government of Seychelles last year, I think. And here basically they look, someone says that these blue loans from the proceeds of the blue bond, they have high interest, so we cannot really benefit from this. And many fisher folk actually testify that they are leaving business because they cannot even, they are operating at a loss. Okay. So the second case study, Nordic-Baltic blue bonds. You will think that it operates in many ways better in the global north, but it doesn't. So the thing is, Nordic-Baltic blue bonds were issued in 2019 and 20. This was much higher, of course, amount, $400 million US compared to 50 million in the Seychelles. And the main sustainability goal was supporting the protection of the Baltic Sea. And Nordic Investment Bank is the regional development bank that is mandated to support regional development, right? And it is kind of capitalized by the nine Nordic and Baltic countries. And it really supports investments for the protection of the Baltic Sea. It's one of its mandates. So they issued these two blue bonds in 2019 and 20, and they reserved the money for mainly wastewater treatment plants in the region. And wastewater treatment is quite important because Baltic Sea is the most polluted sea of Europe, right? So there is so much eutrophication, and to prevent that, actually wastewater and clarification of wastewater plays a key role because states need to reduce their nitrogen discharge from wastewater, basically, to prevent the eutrophication in Baltic Sea. So actually, you have a legal instrument, Helsinki Convention, which is a regional instrument, and underlying that you have the Baltic Sea Action Plan that aims that. So legally, you can situate these investments, this blue bond, in this kind of regional legal setting. So if you look at but there's an environmental additional problem again. So if you look at the impact report, it's all public, right? You can all find after the presentation. You have 13 projects that are financed by the blue bond proceeds. 12 of these projects went to expansion of wastewater treatment plants, but only two of these projects prove that there is reduced discharge of pollutants. And one of them basically justifies its sustainability characteristics or environmental impact as the increase of discharge capacity from the wastewater treatment plant and reduction of the overflows of untreated wastewater into the Baltic Sea. So we can take this as well. Let's say 3 out of 12, right? But the rest of it, so this is the project that is justified by nitrogen discharge. This is the recovery of phosphorus, so these are good. But the rest 9 are not justified by any environmental indicator. So here you have 6 projects, 6 wastewater treatment plants, and there the measure of impact is indexed to the number of people that the expansion can serve. So basically you have, in these projects, you have residential urban expansion in residential areas. These wastewater treatment plants need to expand their capacity to treat more people, more inhabitants in these urban areas. So this is the success, this is the impact of the investment. While actually, if you think these municipalities, these local governments already need to provide this wastewater treatment service to their citizens anyways, right? So there is not really a reduction of pollutants to the Baltic Sea in any way. So what is the environmental additionality here? What is the sustainability, right? So this is quite problematic, and even and even in other 3 wastewater treatment plant projects, there is no impact indicator at all. As you can see here, there's no impact indicator. So here is empty, here's empty, here's empty. So no impact indicator. So actually here you can again see that kind of even this can be considered as almost development finance, but not also really, because it just finance public services that needs to be financed anyways, right? Okay. So the third case study, Belize Blue Bond. Unfortunately, things are becoming a little bit more even spicier here because there are human rights violations. So the thing is, Belize's debt for ocean conservation swap in 2021 was a very big deal, right? Because the country was a serial defaulter, as they called in the financial world, on their sovereign debt, and they could restructure all of their commercial debt, basically $554 million US. They got reduction, 45% reduction on their more than 500 million debt. And TNC said that, okay, you are highly indebted. We will come and help you. We will help you negotiate with your bondholders. We will help you find the loan, but we want you to promise us an environmental impact. So TNC said that, okay, we want you to promise us that you will protect 30% of your EEZ as its objective under global diversity framework. And also you will spend some part of the savings to marine conservation activities in line with the marine protected area target. So here, and the TNC was, well, they wanted to ensure both, first of all, investors, but also TNC said that we are putting our reputation on table. So we need to ensure that. And they are imposing $1.25 million US yearly punishment fee on Belize if Belize doesn't meet these conservation commitments. There are several milestones that needs to be completed by a certain date. And yeah, there's this fee as well. This kind of to incentivize Belize to meet their commitments. But if we come back to the structure, it's a little bit complex structure, but the main thing is that now Belize reduced its commercial debt by 45%. That's quite high. They had 189 million reduction discount on their sovereign debt, which is quite important for a small island developing state. And here, this is the structure. So the Nature Conservancy collaborated with the Credit Suisse. They issued a blue bond to the investors, and Credit Suisse gave the money to the Nature Conservancy, and Nature Conservancy gave these proceeds in the form of a blue loan to the government. So government did not issue a blue bond, but this was kind of given to the government as a blue loan, so that also they could have binding conservation commitments in the loan agreement, right? Because it's otherwise difficult in the bond prospectus to kind of impose conditions upon a sovereign government. So this was a structure, and one important thing here is that U.S. Development Finance Corporation guaranteed the blue loan by justifying that the Nature Conservancy is an actor in the US. So it's important for our economy. So they guaranteed it. They provided a 100% guarantee. So you would expect that for investors, the risk will be lower. And because of this guarantee, this operation went through, investors were convinced to invest in this blue bond. but still, if you look at the interest rate there, the Belize is paying is quite high. So Belize is also paying for the cost of insurance to the US Development Finance Corporation. They're also paying climate catastrophe insurance to insure also their payments in case of a climate catastrophe. So Belize is almost paying double in 20 years of the money they get. But yeah, so this is just an important aspect for common but differentiated responsibilities. I will not go into detail. But so yeah, and Belize committed to spend some of the savings to conservation activities, right? There is a non-government majority conservation trust fund in Belize now, Belize Fund for Sustainable Future, and they are allocating money to 4 thematic areas. Basically, it's about protection of biodiversity, sustainable fisheries, climate resilience, and blue business innovation. So I think what is important here is that even though Belize committed to protect 30% of its marine protected areas, of course, they need to balance this with the kind of human rights obligations to respect people's livelihoods, respect fisher folks' livelihoods, especially, right? And it's important. Belize is a special case in this sense because Belize has the second most impoverished fisheries households in the Caribbean region, according to a CARICOM research. So in this sense, of course, then one thinks about, okay, but what is the impact of marine protected areas on fisherfolk? So here I identified 2 legal issues. One is, of course, the right to participation because of the consultation process in establishing marine protected areas, but also the right to an adequate standard of living of the fisheries households. So just to give a snapshot, right to an adequate standard of living is about the access to means and resources to sustain your livelihoods in a secure way, right? Okay, so during my fieldwork in the Seychelles, and of course my review, one good thing about this process is that they publish most of the meeting documents from consultation meetings, but also pictures. So these pictures are published by the government of Belize. So if you look at the consultation to determine which marine areas will be protected, there is unfortunately a very low rate of participation. So some meetings look like this, for instance, and this is in one of the fishing villages that I also visited 2 years ago. And there is a high distrust from local fisheries sector towards the government because there were already marine protected areas that were established prior to 2021. And there they say that we attended meetings, we showed the government which areas we were fishing, which areas had good fish stocks, and they went and closed those places. So one of the elements there is that the government has been trying to protect areas with high biodiversity status at the moment, kind of. Not the places that needs replenishment, right? Because you could also kind of protect areas where fish stocks are decreasing a lot, where they are in threat, so that the stocks actually could replenish. But they are doing the other way around, where there's high biodiversity status already, and they are kind of establishing those areas as the marine protected areas. Yeah, so there's high distrust, and if you look at the low participation rate, so these are different fishing villages from north to the south of Belize. I went to most of these fishing villages. I traveled from north to the south. I interviewed people, and as you see, in the first round of consultations in 2023, at 8 out of 11 locations, there were less than 20 people, right? And there are 3, only if you think of fisheries sector, there are more than 3,000 licensed fisherfolk in Belize. And this is only the fisheries sector. You can think of also other stakeholders like tourism sector and tour guides and everything. But then the government changed the kind of, they need to establish 30% until the end of 2026, right? So the government changed strategy and they went to fishing villages to collect data. They did an ocean survey with 566 stakeholders that use marine spaces in Belize. That kind of roughly represent around 2,000 marine users, so that they could have a map of marine space in Belize and the use of marine spaces. So where fisherfolk fishes, where tourism takes place, where there is a cultural value, for instance, etc. And according to that, they proposed last 5% increase last autumn, last November, the last milestone. So they had already had 25% marine protected areas. They needed to complete it to 30%, right, by the end of this year. And they proposed certain areas based on the ocean survey. But then in their last round of consultation meetings, there was a big pushback by the fisher folk saying that, no, we are fishing in those areas and you shouldn't close them. So now the government kind of is reviewing those proposals again to see if they can propose other areas for, yeah. And the good thing is that, again, it's all transparent. You can also read the consultation meeting reports on the website of Belize Sustainable Ocean Plan. Yeah. Just another example from a consultation meeting that took place in Belize City, which is the most crowded city of Belize, of the country. And here, two people, I know on the two people on the right, they're already from the government who are doing the consultations, basically. And these are some quotes from northern and southern fisher folk on top. You see that if you don't have proper consultations, if you don't realize right to participation in these processes, then the marine protection can become counterproductive almost, right? Because many fisher folk confirm that they continue fishing illegally in protected areas. And if they don't do that, they will not have enough revenue, basically, to bring to their households. And yeah, and they also, fishermen don't have much trust to the government. They say that, well, they do consultations, but actually they already have an idea of protected areas in their mind. They just come, they do the consultations to justify their already informed ideas. And their ideas, the more protected areas, are not informed by our input. On the other hand, when you go to the government, someone from the Prime Minister's office told me clearly that, like, I will dare anybody to bring me a fisherman who is displaced because of marine protected areas. And then after this interview, I went back to some of the fisheries associations I spoke to, saying that this is what the response I'm getting. So what do you say to this? And some of them were able to show the places they used to fish, but they were displaced. So indeed, if the government had a meaningful consultation, meaningful participation opportunity with the local fisher folk, actually government could see that fisher folk are displaced. So of course here the problem is about mainly right to participation, but also right to an adequate standard of living, right? Because marine protected areas hinder fisher folks' access to means and resources to sustain their livelihoods. And indeed, they are having less and less revenue. And there is also, of course, when they are displaced to areas with already low fish stocks, also those fish stocks are depleting more and more. So there's counterproductive it's a whole chain of non-conservation measures almost. So you could think of, okay, there was $189 million saving from the debt swap. Can't we use this for compensation, right? Compensating sustainable fisher folk. So of course, the funding, the savings are transformed into grants, and these grants are allocated based on demand and through a competitive process. So this conservation trust fund allocates that, but of course, to do that, you need to have a project, you need to have a, environmental social impact assessment, etc. And now the trust fund is trying to make the process easier. And there's a fisheries association that received funding, but they received the grant for construction of their association building, but also an entrepreneurship training for becoming tour guides. So actually, even the sustainable fisheries funding is promoting fisher folk to quit fishing and to start working in tourism sector. This is kind of the current state. It can change in the future, of course, if the funding starts getting allocated to other activities. And this is just one example. Half of the savings are going to government conservation activities as well. And one of the projects here that was financed, instead of sustainable fisheries, was the, where is it? Here. Staff trained and licensed for firearm used to strengthen compliance. So 363 people are trained in firearms. Is this the biodiversity finance we want to rely on, really? And of course, if you think of why the government is doing it, who benefits from this, etc., the main beneficiary is the tourism sector, right? And that makes sense if you think of which areas are protected and why. So you protect high biodiversity areas to expand your tourism sector, to establish more tourism places, tourism resorts across the island. And indeed, this kind of whole marine conservation policy at Belize to position itself internationally as a country that cares about its biodiversity. This is also confirmed by my many interviews in the government. And you can see that every year the tourist arrivals in Belize increase and increase. And when I was there, they were already expanding the airport. So in that sense, you can also think of, okay, we have marine conservation here, everything is good, but what about the emissions that come from aviation industry? Okay, so it's 1:42. I will stop here. We can continue. Yeah, we can continue later with Q&A. Thank you very much.